Welcome, everybody, to the ABT Time podcast, episode 48. And I've got my ABT Time mug with me, as always. And we've got a wonderful guest today, one of my oldest friends in the science world, Dr. Mark Patterson. Longest friends, I should say. I'm older than him. And I'll bring him on in a few minutes. But let's see, where are we in the world of ABT? What kind of exciting things are going on? We are now in the midst of round 32 of the course with the U.S. Forest Service winding down next week, but we've already started up round 33, and this is the first round ever that Matt is now the professor here at the ABT University. He's teaching this entire round with a group called Counterpart International, a nonprofit working in development issues around the world. Then right after this one finishes, we'll be firing up with U.S. Forest Service again, combined with Bureau of Land Management. And then after that, we have got a major public health organization that we're locking in for the month of May. And along with that, who else have we got? Just on and on. Who's the next one? I think probably NOAA. We're going to do another round with NOAA and lots of other groups all coming together. And then actually Emory University has just confirmed that they're going to be, we ran the course with them last fall, and then they're going to turn it into a university course there. So good God, my whole life story, I'm circling back to the academic world that I once walked away from. That's just figures, and it's more fun than ever. So we kind of built our own little independent university here of sorts in our own form and style, with no departmental memos, no committees, no oversight, no nothing, just making it up as we go along. So on that note, let's start in with actually today's guest is my old office mate from graduate school days, long ago, back in my biology days. And why don't you go ahead and join me right now, Dr. Mark Patterson, now distinguished senior professor at Northeastern University. Give us your grand poobah title. What exactly are you? The professor of what, this, that, and the other thing? I give the world's worst introductions.
It's a mouthful. Professor of Marine and Environmental Sciences and Civil and Environmental Engineering. I have a joint appointment.
Could you get them to put a but in there? And civil
therefore, I have to go to twice as many faculty meetings as your average bear.
Therefore, yeah, truly, that's what I ran away from. Good God. Let's see. So, all right, we are going to conduct a journey here that is going to follow the three predictable elements of past, present, and future. And we're going to start
a hero's journey.
You're going to have a hero's journey. You're the hero. And I am the schmuck that is sitting here trying to pull some stories out of you. And we are going to explore a lot of my schmuckdom from long in the past. And in fact, I've got a perfect first story to begin with, which was right when I first met you. So I was a first-year graduate student at Harvard University in the lab of Ken Siebens, marine ecologist. And Mark was a senior undergraduate living in Mather House at Harvard University, superstar undergrad, and he and I got to be buddies right off the bat. As soon as we met, he was working in Ken's lab as well. And one of the first things that we ever talked about was that you wrote an essay in a competition for the Bowden Prize. And you may not remember all of this. I remember it crystal clear. You gave me a draft of your essay and said, I'd really like to have your comments on this draft. And I swear to God, I gave it back to you with written comments saying, this is not very good, and I don't think you should even submit it in the competition because it's so poorly written. And you answered with, oh gosh, well, your comments are a little late because I already did submit it and I already won the prize. And that was the very first discrediting of my critical skills when it comes to writing capabilities. So that said, I'm surprised you didn't carry that story with you as a grudge the rest of our friendship. You should.
But remember, the happy outcome of the prize was that there was actually cash monnaie
Yes, indeed.
And then I took everybody in the lab, including you, to celebrate at a new ice cream store called Ben and Jerry's that had just opened in Somerville. And we pigged out on my ill-gotten winnings.
Amazing. I've lost that part from the memory banks along with lots of other things. But what I do remember, and then Mark went on to graduate summa magna uber cum laude or whatever it was, and then went into doing a PhD there in the same program. So stayed in the same lab, which was tremendous. And eventually he and I ended up being office mates for a couple of years. And do you remember your nickname for me back then? What did you always call
we
me?
had a line of death made out of duct tape between our two working spaces.
There was that. But
your nickname, I mean, you had so many.
no, it's very simple. You just always called me Phone Man.
Phone man, da 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 da.
Exactly. That was back when we had a dial-up phone in the office, I think. Yep. And you would come in every day and I would be on the phone just working my deals, destined to become a film producer someday, clearly, because that's what I enjoyed doing, was just.
Well, and we also got into trouble because you were making long distance phone calls on said phone, and the business manager for the department was saying, these calls cost money. And then I don't know if you remember that I figured out you could go to the Harvard Kennedy School and there was a phone in the middle of the reading room where you could dial internationally for free. I think you probably used that a couple of times.
Clearly, it was a different generation that today's young people have no understanding what that was like, because everything costs money calling long distance. It was back in an era when you would call long distance and somebody would answer, and then you'd hear them screaming, "Mom, come to the phone. It's long distance. Quick, quick. Money is burning up." People would run frantically. The thing that I remember was the group at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., Bob Stenick's group and Walter Ady's group and all those guys. And I would go down there and visit them. And the Smithsonian had the Watts line, wide area television, telephone service. And so it was a government institution, and you could use their phones to call anywhere you wanted for free, unlimited. And what I would do there, and those guys, they had that giant aquarium there that Walter Ady had built that, was the whole recycling thing. And in the basement, they had a bunch of their offices, these catacombs down in the basement of the Smithsonian. And they would all spend the night, sleep over there. They would work into the wee hours. And then you go down the basement and you find these desks that are these great big tables that had like a 2-foot clearance under them. And you just slide down there with a couple blankets and you sleep down there in the middle of the night. The night watchman would come through and you see a flashlight going all over the place as you're sound asleep. But also you could grab one of those phones and pull it down under the table. And I would call. I remember my mother used to tell these stories for years, that I would call her up and be whispering to her so the night watchman would hear me. "I'm calling you for free on the Watts line at the Smithsonian." Stupid things that we did way back then. But the starting point for this discussion was you and Ron Eder and I in particular, and a few of the other graduate students, formed our own little peer group back then of scratching our heads a lot over communication and going to these meetings like the Benthic ecology meetings and watching these talks, some of the talks were scientists that we knew were not doing very good work, but they were such dog food salesmen, as you labeled them. And that became one of your catchphrases. You got to be a better dog food salesman. And we began to realize that some of these guys are doing crap work, and yet they would get packed theaters when they give their talks because they were such showmen. They were such good communicators that they were going beyond their capability due to their communication skills. And then vice versa. There were other people we knew that were doing brilliant work, but they were so boring in their presentations. And you'd show up and there'd be, only a quarter of the seats taken. And you'd want to tell people at lunch, everybody should go to this talk. The work the guy's doing is really good. And they go, "Yeah, I know, but he's so boring." And I think those were our first days of beginning to make this connection on the importance of communication. What are your thoughts on that back then?
Oh, yes. I remember those days vividly because it was so nerve-wracking, of course, to get up and do public speaking. And there was so much activation energy just to make the graphics.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's
you
true.
had to make your own slides. You had to often develop things in a dark room. And you soon learned that, every symbol visually this is pre-computer, but computers, we remember, I don't know if you remember, we got one of the first PCs in Ken Siebens' lab.
Yes.
Apple IIe.
Yes, of course.
And we saw that something was coming in terms of not only spoken communication, but also visual communication. It was the dawn of computer graphics.
Yeah. And do you remember how you used to put together your graphs for papers and presentations? What was the name of the kit?
The rapidograph.
No, you're forgetting the name. Leroy and his lettering set.
Oh, right. Yes. Yes. The Leroy lettering. Yes.
Yeah. The kind of stencil thing that you had to do that was incredibly tedious, and you'd knock the bottle of ink over and it would put blobs all over your stupid figure.
Start over.
Yeah. It must be mind bending for a student today to imagine that there was a time when there were no computers. Everything was done by hand. And we had that IBM Selectric typewriter in Ken's office that everybody had to use for typing letters and everything. It was always full of dirt and dust, and you get it all over the typewriter ribbon and everything else. Yeah, it was insane.
Ken took, right about time you went off to do your field work in Australia, Ken took a leap of faith. I'd seen that there was this thing called wasn't dot matrix. It was actually one that uses ink. It was made by HP. There was a printer that we could control theoretically with the Apple IIe, but there's no code to do graphs. So I wrote 4,000 lines of code to do plots, and it took several months. And I was out there late at night at the lab. That's how I found human remains on the beach at Dive Beach. Was staying up late one night.
What? I never heard that story.
Oh, you're in Australia, but a human jawbone rolled ashore into the surf zone, probably from a body being disposed by one of Nahant's finest citizens in the Cosa Nostra. But when I remember when Ken Siebens came in and he saw that in 20 seconds I could do a graph that the Leroy lettering set would have taken hours. It was one of those transformative things, sort of what's happening now with some of the software that OpenAI has released with Microsoft's help.
Right. Yeah.
The world shifted.
Yeah, no, that new AI software can look at your images now, and it would look back at those graphs, and all it would say is, you were an idiot. What was wrong with you people back then? Why weren't you smart enough to do better than that? Can you think of what's the best talk you ever, or the best speaker, or anything like that? You don't even have to name names, but what are the characteristics of the best communication you saw as a scientist over the years?
When I was in graduate school with you?
Yeah, or anywhere over the years.
So E.O. Olson made a huge impression on me. We were there right as the field of sociobiology was emerging, which was very controversial. But he had just also published his, magnus opus on the ants with Bert Holdobler. And Wilson would give mesmerizing talks because of the human element, because he understood that you had to have that dynamic tension in the story. So he'd start telling you about, being in the rainforest and an army ant column coming, and then it doing something unexpected. And you were sucked in by the butt and by the narrative so that you paid attention. I remember hanging on every word when he would give talks.
No, he's a good example of that. I was lucky enough to get to be a TA in his Nat Sci 6 course the very first semester I was there. And, I was just mesmerized by his talks. He was such an entertaining guy and so interesting, such a good sport. One of my favorite things, I remember him telling the story about his moment of triple ecstasy. Did you ever hear that tale?
No.
That he, as a graduate student, he had 3 deep passions. The first of which, of course, was insects. The second was islands. Remember Island Biogeography by Wilson and Simberloff or whatever.
Yeah.
Rusty and all that.
Yeah.
And then the third thing was sharks. And he said he was a salachophile, just was totally obsessed with sharks. And then they did that big experiment down the Florida Keys where they took a mangrove island and they fumigated it and stripped off all the insects to do a recolonization experiment. And he said, one day I was standing there at the edge of that mangrove island, plucking off insects. And I looked down in the water and saw a shark. And imagine that intersection, that convergence of all three passions, holding an insect, sitting on an island, looking down at a shark, all in one moment. I mean, that's actually great storytelling, because that's what a story is about, is building to a climax moment like that. And here I am all these years later, I still remember that so clearly, the triple orgasm, basically. He was great. He was a really good storyteller. He was a good guy. Unfortunately, I think in some later years, he got a little scrambled. And I know when I was a professor at University of New Hampshire, somebody in the department, what was her name? Michelle Scott, I think, who had been a graduate student with us there. She got hired, and she brought him in to give the big, like, life sciences super duper lecture with a few hundred people at it. And those sorts of things, when you're like in a big life sciences program, they become kind of competitive between the molecular people and the organismal people. And you try and bring in your best to show them how good a work we do. And Wilson came and gave a terrible discombobulated talk, and all these molecular people said, that's one of your heroes. So that's too bad, later in those later years. But and the other guy that I thought was brilliant communicator, of course, as I've spoken at great length about in all my little films and things, was Stephen Jay Gould. Yes. And in fact, in the DVD excerpts that are in the home DVD version of Flock of Dodos, my movie of 2006, for which you were in the poker game in the movie.
Right.
And then there's one little excerpt where you were talking about Gould and what was it, Bernie Kummel? And you said they used to duke it out. What was that little thing
over plate tectonics, because Bernie didn't accept all the evidence.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah. Well, that's kind of interesting, because that movie. So if any listeners have seen Flock of Dodos, it was a movie I made in 2000. We filmed it in 2005, and kind of the spine of a lot of the movie was a poker game that I put together in Cambridge. The whole movie was about the controversy over the teaching of evolution versus intelligent design, the new form of creationism. And in putting it all together, somebody actually suggested this to me. It might have been Steve Orloff, but somebody said, instead of interviewing 6 or 7 evolutionists, why don't you just pull them all together into one of our old poker games that we used to have there? That was what we did. We all showed up at forgotten his name, but the BU professor at his house, and we filmed that whole thing. We played for 6 hours. We filmed for 4 hours, and Mark Skinner, my good buddy, was in there, and you were in there, and Ron Etter and everybody else. And it served as really a kind of spontaneous insight into the academic world and how a bunch of academics talk and behave when they get together. And eventually it got only a tiny bit.
We epitomized the dodos by a lot of the reactions. We were in danger of going extinct because we hadn't really figured out that the enemy had weaponized communication as a way to get around the truth.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, one of my complaints today, everybody gets sick of hearing me complain, but that movie was a wake-up call for me at how serious this anti-science movement was starting to get to be. And when you and I were graduate students, and Gould had this Tuesday lunch discussion group, every Tuesday I went to it for the first couple of years, and he would get these letters from creationists telling him he was going to go to hell, and this is horrible stuff that he does. And they were always laughable, and we'd tape them up on the little pillar in the middle of his office, and nobody took it seriously. And so in 2005, when the New Yorker had an article titled Devolution that was about the seriousness of the intelligent design movement, that it was being fueled by this institute in Seattle, and they meant business. It was, the George Bush era. I sat up and decided to make that film because I could see it was serious. And this is a lot of my complaint of today, is that these signals were coming long ago. Why didn't the science world
back again?
No, that's
it's Flock of Dodos all over in this.
Oh no, it's not back. It's just been building nonstop since then. Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. So we were looking at the very beginning levels of building then, and it just didn't get taken very seriously. And that's the weak spot of the whole science world. They have so much trouble looking at these social dynamics and realizing that this is going to be a threat to everything. And it wreaked havoc on the whole pandemic. And that's where it all.
Oh, yes. It was
Yeah.
amazingly unconscionable what a poor job was done at the federal level with communicating.
Yeah. When they had that March for Science in 2016, I think I remember you wrote me an email and you said, I just want to show up there with a great big banner that says ABT, ABT, ABT. That's why we're having you here on the podcast. You were an early adopter of ABT. Give me your thoughts on ABT and its use in communication these days.
Well, I've, through the years, encouraged all my grad students to embrace your philosophy, and they've all gotten it right away. When your book, Don't Be Such a Scientist, came out, we got it here at the house right around the holidays, and my brother-in-law, who's a electrician in the trades, saw it lying down, and he picked it up and he read it in one sitting. It was that good. And he said, this could be titled Don't Be Such an Electrician. I mean, it works for anything.
Yeah.
So that book really was a wake up that you were totally onto something, that you're, in a different league, dude.
Now that's nice, because I had a little video in which I quoted my brother on the same thing, who's a lawyer, and he said this could be titled "Don't Be Such a Lawyer."
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yeah. No, same sorts of things, and lots of other people have said that it could also be this, that, or that. Don't be such any profession, because so many of these heavily informational professions just fall victim to the and. I
mean, I've given this book and some of your other books as graduation presents to many students. I try and work in an ABT session in my oceanography classes for the undergraduates. They love it. We don't have the time to do a full training class for the undergrads, but they write in.
You should
make time. We should have a whole class in it, but
you should.
They'll write in the teaching review at the end of the year what they liked about the class, and two things are a constant in the teaching reviews. One is, Dr. Patterson's got a very nice speaking voice that puts me to sleep. I wish he wasn't so soothing to listen to. That's one constant. And then the second constant was, I really like that guy who went off to Hollywood, and we learned about how to package our story, and I'm using it around the table at Thanksgiving now to talk about climate change with my parents who may be on the red side of the divide.
That's hilarious.
So on a more serious note, Northeastern takes innovation very seriously. We're an unusual institution in that every undergraduate has to do not one, not two, but often 3 co-ops, where they go off into the real world for 6 months. They're not in school. They got a job that we help them find. Co-op, something that was invented by Northeastern a century ago. And we've got like 3,800 job opportunities on all 7 continents. We even have co-op in Antarctica at McMurdo and Palmer Station. So the senior leadership said, right, 2 things are happening. One is the thing we might talk about later about ChatGPT, but AI is coming. So our president wrote a book called Robot Proof, how AI is going to transform how you educate young people, and how you're going to have to reinvent yourself to stay one step ahead of AI. The other thing he did was he invited 2 very accomplished captains of industry, Kurt Carlson and Len Polizotto, to engage with faculty like me, administrators. Kurt was president of SRI for 7 crucial years. SRI International is out in California. They're development shop that invented HDMI. They invented Siri, that's in the Apple smartphone. Lynn Polizzotto was head of business development at Polaroid. When Kurt took over in the late 90s at SRI, things were falling apart. They weren't bringing money in the door to keep all these PhDs on payroll. The buildings were falling apart. So he had a big meeting and said, what's the problem here? And they, just like us academics, they raised their hands and said, we're only getting 1 out of every 10 grant proposals that we send in funded. The other 9 go in the trash can. And that's about the usual funding rate. He says, we're going to change that. We're going to develop a method of innovation that nobody else has. And they did. And they changed their success rate from, I think it was 8% to 35%. And it was all communications based.
Oh, wow.
And the first part of it is your stuff. Your acronym's ABT, the innovation acronym that is used very fast and iteratively, the same way you do your training, is called NABC. It stands for need, approach, benefit per cost. That's the B part. And then the last one is C, the competitors. And NABC starts off with a need. And if you don't communicate the need using an ABT narrative, you're screwed. And so we were taught, we being Northeastern, the senior leadership, we had to go through boot camps for NABC repeatedly, once a month for 2 years. And I brought up to Kurt, and so he became aware of your work and did a deep dive on ABT and realized, oh yeah, this is the best way to do the first letter. And my thing, NABC is used whenever a team has to innovate in a very short period of time. I'll give you an example. Like you hear from a funder, often a foundation, they'll call you up on a Thursday and say, we've heard you work on underwater robots and underwater habitats and that you want to save the corals from global warming, whatever. Could you get us something by next Tuesday? So you got a very short period of time. That's where NABC really shines and where the ABT part is so critical to getting the initial hook.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, I was talking to you about the new light blue book.
The new narrative gem. Yes.
Yeah. Well, do you know the first sentence of the whole book, the content? It's this quote from this Silicon Valley communications guru, Christopher Lockhead, in which he says, nobody buys a solution without an effing problem.
Right.
That's what you're talking about there.
That's
and
what I'm talking about.
That is the simplest of quotes, but it underlies everything and all these failed environmental efforts where they come out with these great big solutions and the public didn't say they had a problem, and they try and foist it on the public, namely the entire climate movement. They've tried to foist a solution on the entire planet when most of the planet hadn't bought in yet to there being a problem. Heavily educated people don't grasp the idea that you've got to start with the social dynamic of convincing people there's a problem. And then that's really interesting. So that's woven into your NABC structure there. Yeah. Start with a need. Yeah.
And anyway, it was really gratifying to see that your front end loading is very key to doing a successful NABC pitch. And
now that's really nice. One of the things that's staggering at the moment is that we've had 10 years now propagating this thing, and I gave a TED Med talk exactly 10 years ago on the ABT. There's still not been one journalist that's written an article about it. Really, they don't seem to understand. It doesn't resonate with them. They think this ABT thing is for idiots, and they're dismissive of it. They're a brick wall. I gave up a few years ago, even trying anymore with them. Who cares? We're doing so much good with it. We've got it being used in all these different places down in the trenches. And the other problem is when you get up to the higher levels of any organization, especially academia, there's a pattern that seems to emerge of a lot of these people. They feel they got to that level because they're such good communicators and they just don't need it. And so they don't listen to anything. Yeah. You know this syndrome. Yes, exactly. In fact, a lot syndrome. A number of scientists that you and I both know well, just they've been a brick wall. They haven't been
that TEDx talk, or TED Med talk rather, that you gave. That's the one I introduce when I introduce the topic to my students.
Oh, great.
And that video really works. They're all like,
That guy's
oh,
an idiot.
I mean, it's, they have the jaw drop for, it's very impactful. What is it, about 12 minutes long, I think?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, around 10. Yeah, it was. They told me it would be 12 minutes, and the day I showed up there, they said, "Oh no, we've changed it. You only get 10 minutes." Well, it was too late to change anything, so I talk super fast in it. If you watch it, you should play it for your students on like 80% speed or something like that. Slow it down. Yeah. um, but that's nice. And you're a guy who got a good broad education. Western civilization studies and those sorts of things. And Matt and I now have long discussions about what we're doing here, because Matt is, as I think he was telling you before we got started here, he stumbled into this collaboration as a screenwriter, in which I hired him just to run the logistics, and then he couldn't help but listen to the stuff and began to connect with it and get deeper and deeper and deeper. And he's a very, very good instructor, teacher as well. And so he began running little side workshops that we set him up, and now he's gotten so good that he's really on the same level with me. And so we have these long discussions about, because we've been unearthing this thing basically. All this knowledge is there in the human brain. Just nobody's ever come at it from this perspective of digging deep into the community that figured out on the practical side, which is Hollywood. They've had a century of figuring this out. And the academic world just hasn't. They have not figured this out. The literary departments, literature departments, and all these universities, they don't know nothing about the practical side of communication using narrative structure, but Hollywood does, the screenwriters. And that's why it began to connect with Matt so much, because he had that background in screenwriting. And you begin to see that this knowledge, it was there in the 1700s. The great philosophers identified this tripartite structure of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the Hegelian dialectic and the triad. It all existed. And what happened in the past century is this academic world just blossomed and produced these massive sedimentary layers of information and, quote, learning and knowledge, to the point now where it's covered up all of these priceless relics, of which the ABT is one of them. Really, it's all we've done is dig down through those sedimentary layers and discover this thing that those philosophers had already identified. And in 1975, Michael Crichton wrote this paper about obfuscation. And in his last paragraph, he says, only in the 20th century has obfuscation become acceptable. And that's what we were raised in, that system. Furthermore, we grew up in the 1980s in graduate school there, and that was the information explosion. And that really is when these things just got buried, and that's when obfuscation just went crazy. And so in a lot of ways, what we're doing here is kind of retro. We're really just pointing back to the simplicity that once existed. And it's the only hope, I think, in a world of too much information, is to try and look for these simple things. I compare it a lot to like the Hox genes in the genome, of these simple elements of sequence of information deep inside the genome that every organism has in common. It's just that every different species has gone and taken that stuff and radiated outwards with all this complexity that's been added onto it. But, comparative anatomy is just that, looking at those basic. Remember, what was it, the Bio 101 course? I think you and I were TAs in. We did that whole comparative skulls exercise. I mean, that was just so enlightening to me, looking at shared derived characters, and you begin to see all these creatures. And the MCZ museum there, the Museum of Comparative Zoology, that we walk through the back door of every day, getting to that conference room and looking at all those skeletons and seeing they all have the same basic body plan. They're just all radiated out in so many different directions. And I think that's at the core of ABT, which is it's that simple body plan that's at the center of the stuff. And then it's also, I remember the early 90s when I first got to UNH, Ron Etter and I both caught fire over Gleick's book and chaos and fractals and all that stuff. And there's one book that's come out on screenwriting in which the guys talked about the fractal nature of storytelling, but that's what it is. And he says at the core, there's this tripartite structure of beginning, middle, and end, but he doesn't put his finger on ABT, but that's what that is. That all makes sense to you from your analytical brain of all the mathematics that you've had over the years?
So I'm actually a humanities scholar in disguise. I decided I was the first in my family to go to a 4-year college, so that was a big deal to get into a place like Harvard. And I could have easily been a Scandinavian literature or philosophy major instead of a bio major, but I just love those things so much. I took so much philosophy and so many classes in things like Beowulf and the Icelandic sagas, etc. So it was very distressing to see that New Yorker article that you sent about the complete crashing of humanity. Some of it's been themselves, departments shooting themselves in the foot because they've gotten buried by sediments and haven't kept true to their roots. I was lucky in that I went to a public high school that my mom deliberately moved us to that was largely refugees from fascism, largely Jewish refugees in Brighton, New York, who realized the value of writing and thinking so that you'd know when you were being sold a bill of goods by a fascist. And I had incredible English teachers in high school, and I tried to seek out people of that same level when I got to Harvard as an undergrad. I remember Alice Hill from high school said that if you learn how to write in my class, you will learn how to think. That if you can write well, most likely you can think well. And that's stayed with me. So, when I was an undergrad and then later a tutor like you and I were, do you remember William Alfred, the poet laureate, who was the famous professor that sort of launched Faye Dunaway's career? He was a screenwriter, playwright. He was also the English senior common room member at Kirkland House. So he used to come and do dramatic readings or write poems for special occasions on anything that happened in Kirkland House, which was wonderful. And the kids I teach, they get exposed, all the STEM students get exposed to nothing of what I got. So
says the bitter old men, you stupid students.
Well, I feel sorry that STEM students feel like
God.
Why would I take a class in literature?
Yeah. Well, let me interject one question. Did you okay, you remember Mark Ashenfelter?
Yes.
I've stayed close friends with him. He was an undergraduate in Winthrop House when I was the resident biology tutor. He's part of the whole crazy gang of the Loads that I fell in with and all those separate stories. But Mark became a lawyer and still lives in Connecticut. And every time I go back to New York, I go and stay with he and his wife and hang out with all their friends. But one night we're sitting in his kitchen and I was talking about the ABT. And all of a sudden he's just, he starts spilling his cocktail. He's so excited. Says withdrawal, devastation, return. Albert Bates Lord, Albert Lord, Albert Bates Lord. Did you have his course?
No, I did not. I did not have. I know of this prof, but I didn't. But was that?
Exactly.
That's a mythology class.
Let's see. I'm looking at his Wikipedia page. He was a professor of Slavic and comparative literature at Harvard University, who, after the death of his mentor Milman Parry, carried on Parry's research on epic poetry. I did actually have a class from him. Okay. He authored the book, The Singer of Tales, first published in 1960. Right. And that was all about the oral tradition and storytelling. Yes. And one of his important works was he took the Iliad and identified this recurring pattern in it of withdrawal, devastation, return, which is just ABT. And there are 7 cycles of withdrawal, devastation, return in the Iliad, I guess, because I a few years ago I dug into it a bit and read up on it. Cool. And so Mark knew that from his course. And so when I started talking ABT, it would resonate with him. And all of a sudden he put it together. Wait a second, withdrawal, devastation, return. That's what it is. And again, that is the universality and timelessness of this tripartite structure that today's stupid world of academics and too much information, and especially all the psychology people who have overcomplicated the hell out of everything, have given us a world in which this academic community that grades right into the liberal community and the left just don't know how to communicate at all with simplicity because they're so gobbled up in all that stuff. And it's tragic, but it's got real world consequences now that you saw in the pandemic, among other things, people dying in a world of confusion because the people in charge have lost the ability to communicate with any sort of simplicity and clarity. And that's as much as we're working on. But yeah, that's why I was wondering what you had as an undergraduate. And when you say you had the humanities, but you didn't have Albert Bates Lord, you would have learned about withdrawal, devastation, return, WDR.
Well, I think you were brilliant to discover just the importance of often single words in narrative, the middle word, the but, with your friend that did the functional MRI that showed that the brain is keyed to light up. And
I wish he was my friend. He doesn't ever seem to want to have anything to do with me, the neurophysiologist. Yeah, exactly. But no, you're right. That's in that TED Med talk. Exactly. And
yeah,
I tried for years to get him interested in collaborating or something like that. And I think I just came off as some clown to him. But that's the literal mindedness of the science world. And that's the tragedy. What happened with Michael Crichton. Here was this brilliant guy, but as soon as he touched Hollywood, he turned into a clown in their eyes and was never taken seriously again. Yeah. You and I were talking before we started here about, you had some suggestions. Why don't you go and do this and this and these other little fields and these other niches? Trying to cross a niche in a siloed world like today is just about impossible. Everything is just so channelized that people just, one of the tragic things that I came across when I was writing Don't Be Such a Scientist, there's a guy at UCLA named Richard Lanham, who wrote a great book called The Economics of Attention. And I read it and I thought, oh my God, this must be one of the transformative books. And then I go to Amazon and there was only like 12 reviews of it. Like, what the hell? Why isn't this a bestseller? Eventually tracked him down and had lunch with him. And I said, isn't your book like being talked about everywhere? And he said, oh no, I'm an English literature professor. The book is about communications. And as a result, all the communications experts won't even read it. They wouldn't review it. They wouldn't touch it. This is how bad it is with these silos. If you're not in our club. And it made me think back when I was a marine biologist, if some fisherman had come to me with some theory about metamorphosis in starfish larvae, I never would have listened to him. Like, where's your PhD? I mean, you just it's inevitable. You get entrained into that sort of channelized thinking mode. And I don't know how you get beyond it. It limits today's knowledge, and so much so. I don't know. What you got any solutions for that?
That's why our president set a tone here at Northeastern, which is why this was the best move ever for me, is that we actively look for silos disciplinarily and we try and blow them up here at this university, which others pay lip service to. We actually do it here, and it's unlike any other institution I've been at, Randy. So that's
actually, flashing back to you telling that story about how your dean, whoever it was, increased the acceptance rate from 10% to 30% you said. And I thought you were going to connect it with that Jawbone story and say that he contacted the Cosa Nostra and sent them down to DC to lean on all the reviewers. Now that would be the true New England way to get your way in the world. And by the way, you do have a soothing voice. And you're also one of the all-time best explainer-in-chiefs. And all the way back to when we were office mates, you were always the greatest guy, as everybody knew. If you want something complicated in the world of physics and biomechanics explained to you, come talk to Mark. I remember I never would have begun to understand piezoelectric fields if not for you. And your explanations of that and so many other things, especially when we were down in the habitat 60 feet down in Hydrolab, which leads me then, we got about 10 minutes left here for the home stretch. Tell me about the Proteus space station of the sea.
It's been my obsession and passion since about 2017. To back up 5 years before that, NOAA decided to Deep Six, the only working underwater laboratory Aquarius, in 2012 because of a budget crisis.
And by the way, you and I were fellow hydronauts in 1984.
Yes, we were in the predecessor habitat.
Yeah, Hydrolab back in the primitive days. Yes, we spent 8 days, 60 feet down in St. Croix on a coral reef. So yes.
Anyway, for your listeners that don't know what an underwater habitat is, it's a way to get around the limitation of diving from the surface out of a boat, because instead of going back when your scuba tank's used up, you go to this underwater laboratory and you can refill your tank. And at the end of the day, you can go to it to get some shut-eye, collaborate on the internet with colleagues, actually control experiments from the power and internet connection you've got, which is what I started doing back in the day when we first saturated. So in 2012, I invited Sylvia Earle, her deepness, to live with me for 5 days, trying to save the habitat from extinction in the federal budget. And I was her handler. I learned from the best. Always put the person in front of the camera who's going to do the best job communicating, which of course is Sylvia. And so we had a complex schedule. We were on, or she was on, everything from Good Morning America to A Moment is Zen with Jon Stewart, to calling the White House, to talking to the congressional delegation from Florida, trying to stop this decision by NOAA. We did not succeed. However, we did save the habitat from being flooded and turned into an artificial reef, which was NOAA's plan, because we got the attention through our communication strategy of a billionaire who lived in Miami, who actually lived in Key Largo, had no idea that there was this habitat offshore, took an interest in it, and convinced the president of Florida International University to take over the operation. So our short-term goal was met. But during that mission, we had a visit from the grandson of Jacques Cousteau, Fabien, who's his eldest grandchild. Fabien's been scuba diving since he was 4. He spent his entire life as an ocean communicator, conservationist. He's based out of New York. He's got the Fabien Cousteau Ocean Learning Center, which is a 501c3. He came and visited us, and we did a segment with him in the habitat in 2012. And he was so taken with the experience of being there for an hour. He said, I want to do this. So fast forward 2 years later, he did a 31-day mission in Aquarius called Mission 31. And Northeastern, myself and my colleague Brian Helmuth, we were his science advisors topside. And that showed us the power of a celebrity. We had 30 billion with a B media impressions. And the media team estimated that 1 out of every 8 people alive on the planet heard about Mission 31 in some form because we had saturated so many venues. So it was a big success. We got a lot of interesting science done. It was probably the highest profile thing Northeastern's ever done in terms of outreach. When it was over, he was starting to think about, well, okay, that was great, but I had to rent that thing. And it was really arduous to live for 31 days and 600 square feet with 5 other people and skin erupting and sores all the time. There's got to be a better way where we can thrive, not just survive doing marine science. So he hatched the Proteus project. So Proteus will be truly a huge human presence on the seafloor. It'll be probably 10 times the size of the current habitat Aquarius that's still running.
Wow.
It'll be located in Curacao. It will have a team of anywhere between 18 to 24 aquanaut scientists. It will have nice living quarters with a working indoor toilet instead of having to go out on the reef, which is what we had to do in Hydrolab as well as Aquarius.
And it won't have the toilet explodes that leaves the Hiroshima impression.
No more exploding toilets. It will have an underwater broadcast studio. We're planning to engage the public through daily broadcasts, the underwater weather, what's happening to coral reefs, what are microplastics doing here, how do we raise food sustainably in the ocean. It will have state-of-the-art laboratories to do drug discovery, for example. So we're going to short circuit the pipeline for new drugs because the scientists will be out there for 8 to 12 hours a day getting to know the creatures on the reef. But they will also be working down into what's called the mesophotic zone, much deeper than you and I worked when we lived in Aquarius with a hatch depth of about, or Hydrolab, hatch depth of about 60 feet. There's plans to make this habitat be operable on mixed gas and have missions down so that we can be working at 300.
And this is for what year are you thinking?
We hope to have the first metal splashed and in place at the shallower hatch depth by 2025.
And I'm guessing that will be run entirely by artificial intelligence, and the robots will be in command of everything, and you guys will just be these little human puppets that are taking orders from the AI that tells
As
you to
long
get
as
out
Hal
and
doesn't lock us out of the habitat.
Exactly. And if the AI shoots footage and doesn't like what it sees, it will just fabricate its own, and it'll all be perfect imagery of everything. Achievement at Christmas. So that was our final topic to get to. And, you know, once upon a time when I was a postdoc at Harbor Branch in Florida in the late 80s, went to Disney World, or no, to whatchamacallit, the Epcot.
Epcot,
So,
yeah.
They had their big living seas thing there.
Yes.
Yeah, and you walk through that and everything's amazing, and talking about all the science going on under the sea, this, that, and the other thing. And I got to thinking that whole exhibit should have ended with you walking out into the lab at Discovery Bay Marine Lab in Jamaica, which by then was rotted and fallen to pieces, and all the microscopes were all rusted up, and everything was a pile of garbage with a reef that had died from the hurricane that you and I were there for. And the majority of the marine labs throughout the Caribbean were all in such state of dilapidation. And just the fundamental divide between, this is, by the way, this is, we need to talk some more about the ABT, because Matt and I've gotten so much deeper into it. And what I've come to see inside the ABT is that it's the exact same thing that you deal with in statistics and in science of observed, expected versus observed. That's all that communication is about, is expected versus observed. You know, you talk to people about what we expect in the world, then you start talking about what we're actually seeing, and there's your contradiction, and there's the activation energy that activates the brain. Well, that would have been the ultimate expected versus observed exhibit, to walk through that living seas thing that gives you the impression like, oh my God, just like outer space, all these underwater hydronauts are doing this amazing work, and then give us the observed of all these rusted, underfunded labs collapsing throughout the Caribbean. Because I was there in the summer of you and I both were, the summer of 1978 and 80. You were there the summer of 80 when we went through Hurricane Allen in Jamaica at Discovery Bay Marine Lab. And they had blueprints for this enormous laboratory complex there that was going to be built for, you know, millions and millions of dollars. The hurricane hit, destroyed the reef, everything just collapsed. There was no funding. And by the end of the decade, it was, you know, pile of garbage. That was the arc of so much of that research. And it's just this tragic thing of expected versus observed, and the public quite often doesn't.
That's where Fabian hopes this will change the narrative, and this will become in some sense the moonshot for
it's very good. And you know, let me encourage you, and by the way, Matt, we're going to send Mark 20 copies of the new book. And anybody who's listening to this podcast, if you've gotten this far into it and you have a group of people that you could hand out 15 or 20 copies to, send us an email. And, you know, it's only $2 a copy. We'll be glad to buy you a bunch and send them to you. So that's your prize for hanging in there and listening to the whole discussion.
Thank you.
But Matt, let's make a note to send Mark 20 of these copies, and then that will guilt Mark into reading the book and consuming it in graphic detail, because in there is the Matt template, which is quite possibly our biggest innovation of all with the ABT. And the Matt template is the simple emotional application of ABT dynamics, which is heaven and heaven, but hell, therefore action. And it applies to every piece of communication, including research proposals with the National Science Foundation and Diana Padilla, who's been doing probably 25 times she's given the talk in the course on applying the ABT to proposal writing. And I think she's gotten deeper and deeper into understanding that that's what you're doing in a proposal. You need to begin by painting a picture of heaven to us. And that sounds like that's what Fabian's doing. You should read that and digest it and talk to him about that, because that is how you motivate the masses, is beginning with painting a picture of, I see a future of this, that, and the other thing. So that's really great. It sounds like what you've got going there. It's about having that dream of where we need to get things, and then pointing out to people, here's where we are now, let's get to work. And that's so much better than what, unfortunately, the vast majority of environmentalists have done for decades, which is to just cut right to the problems. You people ruined everything here, but there's hope if we do this and that. That is such backwards thinking. The Matt template is the procedure for everybody to be using. And not surprisingly, it is at the core of the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech. He begins by talking about the dream. Then he goes into, now let's talk about where we are today. So that's very cool. I would encourage you to think about that in your work with Fabian. That comparison, how that motivates people. starting with the dream, but then dropping the butt bomb. And then that's where we introduce in this new book, the butt bomb as a term as well. And that's something, by the way, you got to digest that.
Of course, I like that.
Oh yeah, you got it. Well, that came from Marlis and Keisha from their graduate students. So
Right.
yeah, you got to propagate that with your graduate students. It's on the cover of the book, butt bombs.
Butt bombs.
And that is the simplest term of all to get everybody thinking ABT mode, which is where's your butt bomb? That's what apparently they said. That's what the graduate students took to saying in their graduate seminars, which is, nice talk, but where's your butt bomb?
Right. That's great. What a great catchphrase.
Yeah, that can work it. All right, we got 1.5 minutes left. If you got anything non-bleak to say about ChatGPT, because everything I can see for the academic world looks pretty bleak to me, but maybe I'm missing something.
I'm always an optimist, and I hope it will, speed our ability to get to good solutions the same way search engines did. My worry is that if instead of just these millions of lines of written text that it's scanned for its model, if totalitarian states like Russia or China now allow conversations that are recorded in public to be part of the model, then we're in real trouble, because it will be very hard to tell when you're dealing with a human being or an AI.
Yeah. That's what's coming. Previews of coming attractions. And we could go on at great length at that. But I will say it's a super interesting time right now. The last week or two,
It is.
I've been consumed with studying ChatGPT, talking to the people I know that have got pathways into the inner workings of that world. And is it an opportunity or is it an obstacle? That remains to be seen. I'm thinking it's a potential opportunity if people are motivated, but if they just sit there flat-footed and just let it run over them, then it's who knows, oblivion. We shall see. But on that note, we got to do this again sometime in the not too distant future.
I enjoyed that, Randy.
Yeah, what a treat to get to finally talk to the hardest guy in the world to track down for conversations. Flashing all the way back, my final memory with you was way back when I got the Franklin Knox Fellowship to go to Australia for a year and really spent 2 or 3 years down there doing my graduate work. And I would send you these letters like once a week. It was back in the era where you sat there and diligently wrote these letters and hear nothing back from you, except once every 3 or 4 months, I'd get this like 15-page letter with all these photographs of you and that giant battle axe of a car that you had with a bubble with you saying, "Die, pedestrians," talking about plowing through Harvard Square. And that's always been your mode of communication, all or mostly nothing.
I do have a long time lag. It's also genetic. I pass that on to my daughter, Serena. She does the same thing with her
It's unbelievable. It is genetic, isn't it? It's somewhere there in your DNA. Yeah. We will not hear from him for a year or two, and then all of a sudden we'll get this deluge.
But
here it all comes. Look out, duck and cover. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time here to chat with us.
Great chat.
Yeah.
Thanks,
good
buddy.
luck with everything. Good luck with the Proteus space station of the sea. That sounds like you're absolutely on the right track with that. And sounds very aspirational and visionary, which I love. So
it is. It's very visionary. I love working with Fabian.
That is great. Congrats. Cool, man. All right. Talk to you again one day soon. See ya.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.